The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was, in the opinion of those who later spoke of it, the most unremarkable thing about the entire affair. It sat on the corner of Lord Aldrich Vane's writing desk, a folded square of cream vellum sealed with a crest that was not his, and it had been sitting there for the better part of an hour before anyone thought to mention it to him. The butler had set it down between the inkstand and the unlit lamp, with the particular care of a man who does not wish to be remembered as the one who delivered bad news. The morning light fell through the high windows of Thorngate Hall in pale, measured columns, illuminating the slow drift of dust in the way that winter light always does, without warmth, without mercy, as though it had travelled a long distance to arrive here and found the effort hardly worth it. Lord Vane read the letter once. Then he set it down. Then he read it again. He was not a man given to visible agitation. His face, angular, pale, with eyes the colour of old pewter, was a face that had learned its stillness over decades of cultivated authority, the way a wall learns stillness by being built precisely right and having nothing push against it for long enough. He was 43 years of age, a duke twice over by the accident of a cousin's death and his own careful management of what came after, and he had administered his estates with the cold precision of a man who understood that sentiment was the enemy of order, and that order, once permitted to lapse, was nearly impossible to restore without someone being made to suffer for it. He pressed one hand flat to the surface of his desk, fingers spread. He breathed through his nose, once, twice. The letter was from his solicitor in Outearned. It said, in the polished and regretful language of men paid to say unpleasant things with an air of professional sorrow, that Wyvern Mill, the oldest of the 3 mills on the eastern parcel of his holdings, the one that sat in the crook of the River Solber, where the water ran brown in autumn and clear in spring and cold always, was failing. Had been failing, the solicitor was careful to note, for some time. The rents from the 7 tenant families attached to the mill had not been collected in full for 2 successive seasons. The miller himself, a man named Grout, who had held the position for 17 years, and whose quiet competence had been, in retrospect, the thing holding the entire enterprise together, without anyone having thought to notice it or value it while it was present, had died in November without warning. His replacement had proven, in the solicitor's word, unable. Unable was, for a solicitor, a word of some violence. It meant the man could not inspire the confidence of the workers, could not manage the accounts, could not keep the wheel running or the looms turning, or the tenants from looking at one another over their fences, with the particular unease of people who understand that something is slipping and do not know whose job it is to stop it. The looms were ageing. 3 of the 7 tenants had petitioned for relief. One family, the Sorrells, had already abandoned their cottage without notice, vanishing into the county in the pre-dawn of some unrecorded morning, taking with them what they could carry on a single cart and leaving behind what they could not, which included a good iron range and 3 laying hens, who had been found by the Pelham's youngest child and absorbed quietly into a neighbouring household as though they had always belonged there. Lord Vane set the letter down a second time. He looked at it for a moment without touching it, the way a man looks at something he would prefer not to have been given the responsibility of addressing. Then he picked up his pen, and his face settled back into its habitual expression, which was the expression of a man who has already decided what to do, and is now deciding only whether to feel anything about it. 7 miles north, in the smaller house on the Aldermere Road that had been her home for the past 4 months, Eleanor Vane, who had been Eleanor Ashby before her marriage, and who had, in the privacy of her own thoughts, begun to think of herself as Eleanor Ashby again, with a quiet steadiness that surprised her not at all, was at that same hour sitting at a table that bore almost no resemblance to the one in Thorngate Hall. It was a plain oak table, scarred at one edge where someone had once set down a hot iron carelessly and left the burn as a permanent record of a single moment of inattention. On the table were spread the account books she had inherited from Mrs. Pell, the woman who had managed the household before Eleanor's arrival and who had left them in a state of approximate but not quite full accuracy, which was itself a kind of honesty about the difficulty of keeping records in a house that had not expected to have a resident with expectations. The house was called Fell Cottage, though it was too large for a cottage and had not stood on a fell in living memory. It had 3 bedrooms, a serviceable kitchen, a parlour that smelled of camphor and old wood, and a view over a yard in which nothing presently grew except frost-hardened weeds and one stubborn lavender bush that had survived the season through what appeared to be sheer refusal to acknowledge the cold. There was a housekeeper named Mrs. Finch, who was thin and watchful and possessed the quality of a woman who had long ago stopped expecting much from life and had since found this outlook to be one of the more reliable forms of survival available to a person in her position. She kept the house well. She asked few questions. She had the instinct, rare and valuable, of knowing when to be in a room and when not to be. Eleanor was 27 years old. She had been married to Lord Vane for 3 years and had understood the essential nature of the arrangement within the first 3 months, which was a faster accounting than most people gave her credit for, and which she had shared with no one at the time and had shared with no one since, because she was a woman who understood that knowledge kept quietly was more useful than knowledge displayed. She had dark hair she wore without artifice, brown eyes that people sometimes described as unremarkable, until they noticed those eyes had already taken the measure of a room before the person describing them had finished their first sentence, and hands that were slightly rough at the knuckles from a childhood that had included, unusually for a woman of her particular background, actual work. Her father had run a mill in the Western County before the debt and the legal trouble and the long, quiet dissolution of everything her family had built over 2 generations. He had died when she was 18, leaving her the understanding of how a mill worked, a genuine knowledge of wool grades, a debt she had no legal standing to contest, and a stubborn, unannounced conviction that she was not finished. She ran her finger down the column of figures in Mrs. Pell's account book. The numbers did not account for February, and February was nearly done. She turned to a fresh page. She uncapped her pen. She began, in her neat and consistent hand, to write. She did not yet know about the letter on the desk in Thorngate Hall. She would know within the week. She would know because Lord Vane's solicitor would arrive on a Friday morning in a hired trap and would sit in the parlour of Fell Cottage with his hat on his knee and deliver the news in the manner of a man carrying out instructions he has not been asked to have opinions about, and he would leave behind a sealed letter, which Eleanor would read standing at the parlour window while Mrs. Finch arranged and rearranged the fire in the grate with the pointed industry of a woman who intends to miss nothing. The letter was brief, formal, written in Lord Vane's own hand, which was narrow and precise, and contained, if you looked for it, and Eleanor had looked for it, over 3 years, the way one learns to read weather in a difficult sky, a controlled tension in the downstrokes that was the nearest he came to showing anything. He was assigning her Wyvern Mill. She read the paragraph twice. She was not in the habit of misreading, and she wished to be certain she was not misreading now. He was assigning her Wyvern Mill and its 6 remaining tenant families as what the letter called an exercise in administrative independence. The mill was hers to manage. Any revenues generated would be deposited to her household account. Any deficits incurred would be deducted from the same. He expected quarterly reports prepared to standard form and submitted to his solicitor on the 1st of each new quarter. He did not expect, the letter made plain without stating it, which was the kind of plainness Lord Vane had always been very good at, that there would be revenues worth reporting. She folded the letter. She held it between her hands for a moment, and looked out at the lavender bush in the yard, which had at some point in the previous week produced 3 small new shoots of grey-green growth at its base, cautious and determined in equal measure. She thought about the word independence. She thought about the fact that a man who had never given her anything without calculating what it cost him had chosen to give her a failing mill in the depths of winter with the specific and legible expectation that she would fail to run it, and that this failure would demonstrate something he wished to have demonstrated. She considered this. She filed it away with care in the place where she kept the things she had decided to use in her own time. Then she put on her coat and told Mrs. Finch to arrange a horse and trap for the following morning. The road to Outearned Mill ran east from Outearned along a lane that narrowed steadily as it approached the river, as though the land itself were issuing a warning about what lay at the end of it. Eleanor made the journey on a Saturday in late February, with a sky the colour of old pewter and a wind off the fields, carrying in it the smell of cold mud and, underneath that, the sweeter, older smell of lanolin, the particular wool country smell she had grown up breathing without thinking about it, and which now arrived at the edge of her memory like a hand placed gently on a shoulder. The fields on either side were bare and flat and enormous in the way that winter fields are enormous, with a quality of exposure that is not unfriendly exactly, but that makes no promises. The mill came into view around a bend. A square stone building 3 stories high, dark with damp, sitting at the edge of the river Solber, where the water ran quick over a low weir of mossy stone. The mill pond beside it was still, flat as a held breath, its surface the exact colour of the sky above it. The wheel was not turning. It was not turning because, as Eleanor would learn within the hour, 2 of its paddles had split in the autumn. The replacement timber had been ordered by the previous mill supervisor and never paid for, and the supplier, a man named Croft in Outearned, who was polite and patient and not in the habit of extending credit without assurance, had therefore not delivered it, which was itself the consequence of the mill's accounts having been managed, since Grout's death, by a system that most closely resembled hoping. No one in Thorngate Hall had inquired whether Grout had left instructions. No one had thought to ask. The wheel had sat idle through November, December, January, and now into February, while the river it was meant to harness ran past it without opinion. She stood at the mill door for a moment before knocking. The door was solid oak, swollen at its base from water and repeated winters, and someone had at some point painted it green, though the paint had long since peeled at the corners in thin, curling flakes that gave the door the appearance of something in the middle of changing into something else. She noted the split paddles visible in the wheel's shadow. She noted the silted edge of the mill pond, the weeds pushing up through the paving stones in the shapes of several seasons of neglect, the missing latch on the yard gate, the general air of a place that had been waiting, with diminishing optimism, for someone to decide what to do with it. She knocked. The man who answered was named Birch. He was the mill's current supervisor, a thick-shouldered man in his middle 50s, with the look of someone who had spent most of his working life being told what to think and had found the experience quietly corrosive. He had been installed in the position by the solicitor in January and had spent the intervening weeks primarily attempting to avoid making decisions that might later be identified as his, which was a strategy that had the virtue of consistency and the drawback of producing no outcomes whatsoever. He was surprised to see her. This was visible in the way he held the door, half open, as though he had not yet decided whether to commit to the gesture. She gave him her name. She watched the recognition move across his face in stages, awareness, recalibration, the settling of something uncertain into something it did not quite trust, and she waited while he decided what to do with it. He decided, after a pause, to open the door wider. She spent 4 hours in the mill that morning. She walked every floor, including the storage level above the main machinery that smelled of old grain and mouse and the sweet, dusty residue of milled flour accumulated in the joints of the floorboards over decades of use. She examined the loom machinery with the hands of someone who had operated looms before, running her fingers along the frames, testing the tension of the heddles, noting which parts were worn and which were merely dirty and which were genuinely in need of replacement. She examined the carding equipment. She examined the wheel from every angle she could access, including leaning out over the mill pond edge to assess the condition of the axle housing, which caused Birch an evident moment of private alarm. She asked him questions. She asked specific questions, unhurried, giving him time to answer fully, and she wrote his answers in the small notebook she carried in her coat pocket with the same even hand she used for the account books. She asked about the remaining tenants by name and by family composition. She asked about the state of the weir and the depth of the mill pond at its deepest point, and the last time the wheel had been properly dressed by a millwright. She asked about the outstanding order for the paddle timber and the name of the supplier and whether the account with that supplier was in arrears. He told her. She wrote it down. She asked about the market arrangements, which merchants in Outearned and Fenwick were the mill's established buyers, what prices had been obtained in the last full year of production, whether those arrangements were still in place or whether they had lapsed along with the wheel. Birch knew some of this and not all of it. What he did not know, she noted as a gap to be filled. Before she left, she stood at the mill pond's edge and looked at the wheel. It was a large wheel, 12 feet or more in diameter, built in the old way from elm and oak, with the weight and craft of a construction intended to outlast the people who built it and the people who came after them. The split paddles were on the left side, clearly visible from the bank, 2 of them cracked along their length, the wood grey with weather and age. The damage was not structural. The axle was sound. The crown wheel and the pit wheel, which she had examined from the inspection access below the mill floor, showed normal wear but no crisis. This was a repairable thing. It was an infuriating thing to have been allowed to sit unrepaired for an entire season, but it was a repairable thing. She looked at the river, which was running swift and cold and indifferent, doing what rivers do regardless of whether the structures built to make use of them are functioning. She made her final note. She closed the notebook. She drove back to Fell Cottage in the late afternoon, with the sky going orange in the west and the cold dropping from the east, and Mrs. Finch's basket still mostly full because she had forgotten to eat anything from it, which Mrs. Finch would note upon her return with an expression of complete and unsurprised resignation. That evening she sat at the oak table and wrote 3 letters, one to the timber supplier in Outearned, Croft & Sons, asking for a quotation on seasoned elm sufficient to replace 3 paddles of the relevant dimensions, along with a proposed schedule of payment. One to the agent who had managed Grout's wages, requesting a full account of outstanding payments and the current state of the mill's operating account from the point of the previous autumn. And one to a woman named Margaret Seld, who lived in the market town of Fenwick, and who had been, before her marriage and her subsequent early widowhood, the most perceptive and unsentimental person Eleanor had ever encountered in the business of wool and textile production, a business that had dominated her family's attention before it had occupied her family's ruin, and in which Margaret had somehow managed, through a combination of sharp observation and a complete refusal to apologize for either, to survive and prosper as a woman in a trade that had not been designed with women's survival in mind. She did not write to Lord Vane. There was nothing yet to report. She was a woman who preferred to let the figures speak when figures were available to speak. If you have been following this story from the beginning and you have not yet subscribed to this channel, this would be a natural moment to do so, quietly, without commotion, in the way that Eleanor herself would have approved. The rest of what follows is worth staying for. The timber arrived in the 2nd week of March, paid for out of Eleanor's household account, which she had reviewed with the methodical care she gave to all things, and found adequate for one significant outlay, provided she was economical about everything else, which she was, having been economical about everything else for most of her adult life, without finding it notably difficult. She had negotiated the price herself, by letter, with a precision that had caused the Outearned supplier, Croft, to write back with the slightly bewildered energy of a man who had expected to handle the matter through the solicitor and had instead found himself in direct and specific correspondence with someone who knew the current market rate for seasoned elm, could cite the price his competitor in Fenwick was offering, and was perfectly prepared to wait if he needed time to reconsider. He had reconsidered. The timber arrived on a Wednesday in a hired cart, along with an additional length he had thrown in without explanation, which Eleanor noted in her ledger under the heading Goodwill and moved on. The millwright was a man named Corvin, who had been recommended by Margaret Seld, and who proved, over the 4 days he spent at Wyvern Mill, to be exactly the kind of craftsman whose competence operates through the complete absence of any need to talk about it. He inspected the wheel thoroughly before beginning, running his hands along the axle housing, testing the bearing surfaces, sighting along the wheel race, with the focused attention of someone who has learned the hard way that what is visible on a wheel is not always what matters most. And then he set to work with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who believes, correctly, that the difference between a good repair and a bad one is almost always patience. He replaced the split paddles, he dressed the wheel, he inspected the pit wheel and the wallower and the stone spindle and the sluice gate mechanism and found each one in reasonable condition, serviceable, nothing that could not continue if attended to. On the 5th morning, he stood beside Eleanor at the edge of the mill pond as she drew back the sluice handle and the water found the new paddles, and the wheel began, slowly, to turn. It turned. The sound it made was unlike any sound Eleanor could easily name, lower than a voice, steadier than weather, a deep turning resonance that she felt as much as heard, rising up through the stone of the mill floor and the soles of her boots, and somewhere further in, to a place she had not expected. She had been in mills all her childhood. She had heard wheels turning many times. This one sounded different, she thought, and then understood that it was not the wheel that was different. It was that this wheel was hers. Corvin said nothing. He paid the turning wheel the respectful attention of a craftsman observing his own work, which is a form of quality assessment, but is also, if you are the kind of person who understands how long it takes to become good at a thing, a form of quiet satisfaction. She paid him in full, added a sum above the agreed rate, and thanked him by name, which was not something everyone remembered to do. He nodded, collected his tools, and left with the practical efficiency of a man whose next job was already waiting. Birch was standing at the mill door. She turned to him and she said, "We will need to review the loom frames this week. I would like to start tomorrow morning." And she said it with the simple authority of someone who has decided that something is going to happen, not the authority of someone who is asking whether it might be permitted to try. The tenants came next. There were 6 families remaining on the mill's land: the Pelhams, the Greens, the Oaks, the Tharrows, the Wints, and old Mrs. Culver, who was not precisely a family so much as a singular civic institution, a woman of advanced years and unadvanced patience, who had outlived 2 husbands, 1 son, and what she described, upon Eleanor's first visit, as 3 separate attempts by various landlords and their representatives to make her existence inconvenient, all 3 of which she had simply continued to exist through as a matter of principle. Eleanor visited each household in the 2nd and 3rd weeks of March. She drove herself in the horse and trap because the roads were still too uncertain for anything more formal, and because she had noticed, in the years of her marriage, that arriving without ceremony was the quickest route to arriving honestly. People received ceremony differently than they received a woman who sat down at their kitchen table without requiring them to prepare for her. She was not what any of them expected. She could see this in the way they received her: the held quality of a door not quite opened, the adjustment in posture that is people sorting through their available behaviours to find the right one for a situation they have not encountered before. They had experience of indifference, she understood. They had experience of condescension, of the smooth professional distance of the solicitor's visits, of instructions delivered in the language of management to people who had not been consulted. They did not have much experience of someone who came to ask them what was broken and then wrote it down. She sat in their kitchens. She drank the tea that was offered. She asked them specific questions about the state of their cottages, their land, their equipment, and the practical difficulties of the past 2 seasons, and she listened to what they said with the attention of someone building a picture rather than confirming a prior assumption. The Pelhams had a roof that let in water at the east corner, had let it in since autumn, had been letting it in progressively longer as the winter went on, the damp now travelling 6 feet along the ceiling beam into the bedroom. The Greens and the Oaks had a dispute about a drainage ditch whose course ran between their plots and whose clearance had been left unresolved since Grout's death and had by now settled into a mutual grievance of some firmness, each family certain the other had last cleared it, and therefore certain the other should clear it now. The Wints had a child, a boy of 4, the youngest, who had been ill for most of the winter, with the kind of persistent chest illness that kept the household in a state of low-grade fear and had set their work behind by weeks they could not afford. Eleanor wrote all of it down. She arranged for the Pelham's roof to be repaired by the end of March, hiring the work out to a roofer from Aldenmere and paying for it from the mill's operational account as a landlord's maintenance obligation, which it was. She called the Greens and the Oaks together one afternoon, in the yard between their properties, in the mild March light, with the tone of a woman who finds this kind of impasse a practical problem rather than a moral drama, and walked the course of the drainage ditch with them until the 3 of them had agreed on a maintenance schedule and shaken hands on it. The Wints' arrears she said nothing about. She saw, from the way they waited for her to raise the subject, that they expected her to raise it, and she chose not to, which was its own kind of statement. She called on Mrs. Culver last, on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of March. Mrs. Culver's cottage was set a little apart from the others, at the edge of the mill's land where it met a wood, and it had about it the quality of a place that has been lived in with particular intention. The garden was better organised than anyone would have expected in March. The window glass was clean. There was a cat sleeping on the doorstep with the absolute conviction of an animal that has never been asked to justify its presence. Mrs. Culver received her in a kitchen that smelled of rosemary and vinegar and something warm that turned out to be a pickling operation of impressive scope, with crocks and jars arrayed on shelves along 2 walls of the room, and others in process on the range, and a smell that was sharp and complex, and not unpleasant once you adjusted to it. Mrs. Culver herself was a small woman of perhaps 70, with white hair pinned with efficiency and eyes that were pale blue and deeply attentive in the way of eyes that have had a long time to practice attention. She looked at Eleanor for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "You're not what they sent before." Eleanor said, "No." Mrs. Culver nodded once, with the manner of someone checking off an item on an internal list. She poured tea without asking whether it was wanted, and said, in the same even tone she might have used to discuss the state of the river, "The Sorrell family went to Fenwick. 3rd left past the fulling mill, house with the blue door. Gerald Sorrell is doing day labour for the tanner, which is unpleasant work for a man used to his own land. They'd come back, I expect, if someone thought to ask them." Eleanor said, "I expect they would." Mrs. Culver looked at her over the rim of her cup with the expression of a woman who has revised her assessment of a situation and is not yet committed to saying so out loud. Eleanor wrote down the address of the house with the blue door, finished her tea and drove to Fenwick that same afternoon. By the end of March, Wyvern Mill was running. Not at full capacity, the looms required work, and the new mill supervisor, a woman named Ada Bright, whom Margaret Seld had recommended in terms that Margaret Seld, reserved for people she considered genuinely formidable, was still in the process of establishing her authority over a workforce that had not previously operated under a woman in that role, and required, as Ada herself put it with flat practicality, about 3 weeks to sort themselves out. But the wheel was turning, wool was moving through the carding and the spinning and the first stages of the loom work. In the final week of March, the first lengths of finished cloth left the mill on the back of a cart bound for the Aldenmere market, and the figures in Eleanor's ledger shifted from one kind of entry to another. She sent the first quarterly report on the 1st of April. It was 12 pages, It covered the expenditures of the first quarter, the timber, the millwright, the roof repair, Ada Bright's wages at the rate Eleanor had agreed with her, which was a fair rate and which she had recorded without annotation, against the revenues that had come in during March's final weeks. The revenues were not large. She had not expected them to be large. But they were there, they existed, which was more than they had done in either of the 2 previous seasons. She included a note at the close. I expect the second quarter to show material improvement as loom capacity reaches full operation and market relationships are re-established. She did not editorialize. She did not explain the decisions she had made about the tenants. She trusted that a person reading the figures carefully would draw the appropriate connections. She sealed the report and sent it. She did not hear back. This did not surprise her. She had not sent the report in order to receive a response. She had sent it because it was accurate, and accuracy was, in her experience, the one argument that did not require an audience in order to be true. The Rook came back in April. It had first appeared in February, shortly after her arrival at Fell Cottage, and had been returning with a consistency that Mrs. Finch found unsettling. It was a large bird, even by the standards of rooks, with a pale beak and eyes that were dark and depthlessly attentive, and gave the impression, in certain angles of light, of a creature that had decided to monitor something and had no particular opinion about how long the monitoring might take. It appeared most often at the yard gate in the early mornings, sometimes with a stick, sometimes with a stone, occasionally with nothing, standing with the patient quality of a thing that has arrived and is prepared to wait for the purpose of its arriving to become clear. Mrs. Finch had driven it off several times in February with the energetic disapproval of a woman who is certain that a persistent rook is a sign of something, though she changed her interpretation of the sign each time she was asked about it. Eleanor had not driven it off at all. She had begun, without planning to save the harder crusts from her breakfast and leave them at the gatepost on her way to the horse and trap in the mornings. The rook ate them with the brisk and dignified efficiency of a creature that does not make a great production out of receiving a kindness. In April, it brought her something. She found it on the gatepost one morning, placed with what she could only describe as intention. A small brass button, stamped on its face with a pattern she recognized immediately, in the way that the body recognizes a thing before the mind has finished processing it. The crest of Thorngate Hall. She held it in her palm for a long moment, feeling its small weight, its cold edges, the deliberate precision of the stamped design. She looked up, and the rook was still there, watching with its particular dark attention. And then it lifted away without ceremony in the direction of the river. She carried the button inside. She put it in the drawer of her writing table and closed the drawer. She stood with her hand on the drawer for a moment, not thinking any single clear thing, feeling the weight of the button as though she could still feel it in her palm. And then she went to the table and opened the loom production ledger and sat down to work. She did not yet understand the full meaning of the button. She would understand it later, all at once, in the way that things held quietly sometimes release their meaning only when the time is right for the release. What she knew that morning, without naming it, was that the button had come from a direction and had arrived at a destination, and that the rook had made this journey without being asked to, and that there was, in this, a kind of information she was not yet ready to decide what to do with. She turned to a fresh page of the ledger. She uncapped her pen. The mill wheel, 7 miles east, was turning. The second quarterly report, submitted on the 1st of July, was 22 pages. It covered the full spring production cycle from April through June. It detailed wool processed by grade and weight, cloth lengths completed and their market classification, prices obtained from the 2 established buyers Eleanor had re-contracted in Aldenmere and the new buyer she had located in Fenwick through Margaret Seld's recommendation, a man named Hollis who dealt primarily in fine cloth and who had visited the mill in May with the cautious manner of a man who expects to be wasting his time, and had left with a signed agreement and a revised opinion of how his morning had been spent. The report detailed wages paid, maintenance costs incurred, the replacement of the carding gear that had needed a new part in May, the cost of the survey she had commissioned on the river gradient east of the mill, and the legal correspondence she had initiated with the Water Management Authority about a second weir whose feasibility the survey had, as of the date of the report, confirmed. At the back of the report, after the final figures, she had appended 4 pages of proposals: a timeline for the second weir's construction, a proposed schedule for upgrading 2 of the older loom frames, a plan for the following autumn's wool purchase that would allow the mill to work at capacity through the winter months rather than being dependent on spring deliveries. She had thought carefully about what to include and what to leave for the following quarter's report, and she had included everything that was grounded in the figures and left out everything that was not. The revenues in the second quarter were not small. She was not prone to expressing satisfaction in ways anyone could observe, but she sat with the finished report for a few minutes before sealing it, looking at the final column of figures, and she permitted herself a single, clear acknowledgement of what those figures represented. Not triumph. Something steadier than that. The satisfaction of a person who has done what they set out to do and has the numbers to prove it. Ada Bright had proved, over the 3 months of their working relationship, to be every precise and formidable thing that Margaret Seld had indicated she would be. She ran the mill floor with the calm and specific authority that Eleanor recognised, from her months of observation, as the kind of authority that originates not from rank or instruction, but from the combination of genuine knowledge and consistent fairness that people choose, in their own time and without being persuaded, to follow. The workers were more productive under Ada's supervision than the record suggested they had been under Grout's, though Eleanor noted this without emphasising it, because she understood that Grout had been working without the resources Ada had been given, and that resources matter, and that the attribution of results is rarely as simple as it looks from the column of figures. The Sorrell family had been back in their cottage since April. Gerald Sorrell had not said a great deal when Eleanor had sat with him in the house with the blue door in Fenwick, his wife and 2 children in the kitchen behind him, and the particular dignity of a man accepting something he had not expected from a quarter he had not anticipated. He had said, "We'll pay what we owe." She had said, "Yes, you will, and you will have the time to do it properly." They had shaken hands on it. By June, they had planted their plot with the precision of people who have been given something back that they thought was gone, and intend to make it mean something. On a morning in late July, Eleanor stood at the edge of the mill pond and listened to the wheel. The sound of it had become, in the month since March, the background of her days here. The low, steady, breathing sound of a large thing turning correctly, reliable as weather, more reassuring than weather. The afternoon light caught the water as it left the paddles and scattered it across the mill pond's surface in pieces that did not hold still, but were, each of them, briefly brilliant. She heard footsteps on the lane behind her. She turned. Lord Vane was standing at the yard gate. She had not expected him. She had prepared, in the abstract and involuntary way one prepares for things one believes will eventually happen, for this encounter, and she had prepared for several versions of it. The cold, administrative version, in which he reviewed the mill as a property problem and discussed the second weir with the detached interest of a man assessing an investment. The version in which he was irritated, in the refined and controlled way he was always irritated, at the shape the situation had taken. She had not quite prepared for the version she was looking at now, which was Lord Vane standing at the gate of Wyvern Mill with an expression on his face that she did not have a ready category for. He was not triumphant. He was not embarrassed, which she had considered more likely. He looked, with the particular and unfamiliar quality she could only describe as a man encountering something he had calculated incorrectly, and finding that the encounter has changed not just the calculation, but the method. He came through the gate. He walked the yard slowly, looking at the mill's south face, the outbuildings, the new paddles visible in the wheel's shadow, the clean paving, the repaired gate latch. He looked at the tenants' cottages at the field's edge, with their smoke rising in the still afternoon air. He looked at the river. He looked at the wheel. Then he looked at her. He said, "The report." She said, "Yes." A pause. The wheel turned. The river continued. He said, "I read it, the full thing." She said, "I assumed you had." He said, "The proposal's at the back, the second weir." She said, "The survey confirmed the gradient. I've had the water authority's preliminary approval." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the wheel again, and she let him look, because she understood that there was something he was working toward, and that working toward it was, for this man, something that could not be hurried without losing what it was. He said, "I had not expected this to go as it has." She said, "I know." He said, "I should have." She did not respond to this. It was the most honest thing he had said to her in 3 years, and she received it without either accepting it prematurely or deflecting it. She let it stand between them in the July afternoon, in the sound of the wheel and the river, and she waited. He reached into his coat. He held out his hand. In his palm was a brass button, identical to the one she had placed in the drawer of her writing table in April, except that this one was warm from his pocket, rather than cold from the gatepost where the rook had left it. He said, "I found this on the steps of the West Garden in March. I recognised the crest." She looked at the button. She looked at him. Something moved through her expression that was not quite an answer to a question, but was the acknowledgement that the question had finally been asked in a form she could answer. She said, "There is a rook. It travels between here and Thorngate, I believe. It brought me one in April." He said, "I know the bird. Mrs. Albury considers it a nuisance." She said, "It has very decided opinions about where it goes." The rook in question landed at that moment on the gate post with the timing of a creature either coincidentally present or deeply theatrical. They both looked at it. It looked back at them with the expression of an animal that is following its own agenda and finds the incidental human drama around it mildly interesting. Lord Vane said, with something in his voice she had not heard before, and which she thought might be the sound of a man smiling despite himself, "It brought you a button. What do you suppose it was trying to say?" Eleanor said, "I think it was keeping track of something." A year passed. The second weir was built in October, after the formal engineering consultation and the final agreement with the Water Management Authority, which Eleanor had managed herself through 3 letters of increasing specificity and 1 meeting in Aldenmere that the solicitor had attended, and which she had, by the end of it, led. The wheel at Wyvern Mill now turned faster in the strong current and more steadily in the low current, and its capacity in the first full quarter after the construction exceeded every figure Eleanor had put in her projection by a margin that Ada noted in the ledger with a single dry annotation, "As expected." Eleanor had read this and felt something uncomplicated and warm, which she had also kept to herself, because she was still that kind of person, and she did not think this would change. The Sorrel family had cleared their arrears by September. They had planted lavender along the path from their gate to their cottage door, which Mrs. Culver, upon being told of it, observed was a sign that a family intends to stay. Mrs. Culver's pickling operation had, through an arrangement Eleanor had proposed and Mrs. Culver had accepted after 1 week of consideration, expanded its distribution to 3 market stalls in Aldenmere and 1 in Fenwick, with Eleanor providing the transport network and taking a portion of the additional revenue at a rate Mrs. Culver had negotiated herself and which Eleanor had accepted without adjustment because it was, in her professional opinion, a fair rate, and Mrs. Culver was, in her personal opinion, a woman who had waited long enough to be taken seriously as a commercial concern. Margaret Seld had come to stay at Fell Cottage in September and had remained through October with the air of a woman who has decided that a situation merits her continued attention. She and Ada Bright had developed, over the course of several evenings around the plain oak table with the mill's accounts spread between them and the fire going in the parlour grate, the kind of professional regard that is founded in genuine mutual assessment and which tends, over time, to become the basis of something that matters. No one had named it yet. Eleanor watched it develop with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has learned to recognise things that are still becoming what they will be. Lord Vane had come to Wyvern Mill 5 times since July. Each visit was longer than the one before. In November he had stayed to dinner, and Eleanor had sat across the plain table from him in the plain dining room of Fell Cottage, with the fire lit and the winter pressed against the windows, and the sound of the mill's wheel just audible in the silence between their sentences. And they had talked, not about the mill, eventually, but about other things. The kinds of things that require a prior period of not talking about them in order to be talked about at all. He had a precise and dry humour that she had glimpsed perhaps twice in the years of their marriage, and had since stopped expecting, and it appeared again over the soup and made her laugh before she had finished deciding whether to, and she saw something in his expression shift in the way that things shift when a person is surprised by something they have caused and finds that they would like to cause it again. The last evening of the year was cold and still, with the stars very close, and the frost beginning to form on the stone of the yard by the time they walked to the mill in the hour before midnight. They stood at the edge of the mill pond, not close, but not at the careful, managed distance she had maintained for most of 3 years, and the water held the stars in it perfectly, without movement, the mill pond surface having settled in the cold to the stillness of something that has made up its mind. He reached into his coat. He held something out. She looked at it before she took it. The brass button, the Thorngate crest, the same one she recognised and knew. She took it from his palm and held it in her closed hand, feeling its weight, its small, sharp edges, the story it had travelled to find its way here. The rook's story, her story. The particular kind of story that only makes sense at its end when you can see the shape of what all the separate journeys were part of. She said, "Everything grows when it is no longer alone." He was still for a moment. The mill pond held the sky. Then he said, in the plain and simple way of a man who has decided that the time for saying the adjacent thing is over, "Yes." The year turned. The mill wheel in the morning would turn with it, the water finding the new paddles with the patient force of a river that has all the time in the world and does not need to be hurried, and the stone grinding and the cloth coming off the looms in its pale lengths, and the smoke rising from the cottages at the field's edge where the lavender would grow in spring. And what had been given as a wound, the failing mill, the cold letter, the 7 miles of winter road between a woman and everything she had been told she could not be, had become, through the patient and methodical application of everything Eleanor Ashby had always known herself to be, the thing she had built with her own hands, which was the only kind of belonging she had ever trusted, the only kind she had ever needed to trust.